That morning was different, and it wasn't because of the pain from the wounds, the marks on the body, or the dark, damp, and fetid environment of the prison. What made everything different was the presence that invaded the place. It wasn't an ordinary presence. It wasn't just any presence. It was the presence of God Himself. Paul and Silas had been unjustly beaten. They had been dragged through the streets, beaten with rods, with no right to defend themselves, accused by evil men, and thrown into the deepest prison. Their bodies were bleeding, their clothes were torn, their feet were chained in stocks. But their hearts were free to worship. Around midnight, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of murmuring, instead of complaining, instead of cursing, Paul and Silas began to pray and sing, sing praises to the God who allows, but who also delivers, to the God who sees, to the God who answers, to the God who, even in suffering, continues to be God. The sound of those praises echoed through the prison corridors. Other prisoners listened. Some might have cried. Others, perhaps, felt something they had never felt before. And then ... the supernatural. An earthquake. The earth shook. The structures trembled. The doors opened. The chains came loose. No one fled, because no one wanted to flee from the presence that was there. The jailer, realizing all this, thought about taking his own life. In desperation, fearing that he had lost his prisoners, he drew his sword. But Paul shouted, "Don't hurt yourself. We are all here." The man fell to his knees. "What must I do to be saved?" he asked. And that very night, he and his entire household believed in Jesus. What was supposed to be a night of pain turned into a night of worship. What was supposed to be a time of despair turned into a time of salvation. Paul and Silas' suffering did not stop them from worshiping, and their worship changed destinies. Can you imagine that? Two men, hurt, wronged, completely powerless, and yet singing. Most of us, in a situation like that, would be murmuring, asking God, "Why me? Why now?" But Paul and Silas chose to trust. They chose to worship. They knew that the God who allows the storm is the same God who calms the winds. There was no stage. There were no musical instruments. There was no lighting. There was only pain and faith. There was only blood and surrender. And God was pleased. Heaven bowed down to hear that song that was born not from the lips, but from the soul. The purest praise that can exist. The one that comes from the midst of pain. How often do we wait until everything is okay before we praise? We say, "When things get better, I'll sing. When God answers me, I'll testify." But Paul and Silas teach us that the most powerful worship is that which arises in the midst of suffering, because it doesn't depend on circumstances. It depends on faith that God does not despise a broken heart. God does not ignore worship that comes through tears. He moves, He responds, He acts. And in that prison, God moved the heavens. He moved the earth. He moved hearts. Sometimes God won't get you out of prison right away. Sometimes He won't keep you from being whipped, accused, humiliated. But He will be with you. He will sustain your soul. He will turn your suffering into testimony. He will use your wounds to heal others. That jailer was never the same again, because he saw men who, even when wounded, worshipped. He saw that there was a different God, a God who liberates, yes, but before liberating the body, He liberates the soul. And that is what changes everything. Do you know what impresses me most about this story? It's that Paul and Silas didn't know the earthquake was coming. They didn't start praising because they were sure they would be free. They praised because God was worthy, even if nothing happened. That's mature faith. That's surrender. Sometimes we praise expecting something in return. But true worship is the kind that says, even if there is no response, even if I stay here, even if it hurts, I will worship you, Lord. That kind of praise moves heaven. That kind of faith shakes prisons. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And I wonder, how many times are our prisons emotional? How many times are our bodies free, but our souls are chained? Trapped in hurts, traumas, guilt, fears. And we stop praising because we think God has forgotten us. But Paul and Silas show us that it is precisely in prison that we must raise our voices, because praise doesn't just change the external environment. It changes the internal environment. Praise changes the heart. It takes the focus off the problem and puts the focus on God. It turns tears into strength. It turns chaos into an altar. When Paul and Silas praised, all the prisoners heard. This is very symbolic, because sometimes our praise is the only light that someone close to us will see. Sometimes our response to pain is the testimony that someone needs to believe. And God allows us to go through certain prisons, not only for our sake, but for the sake of those around us, that their worship not only brought deliverance, but it brought salvation. It not only broke chains, but it opened hearts. And that is powerful, because it shows that God can use even our greatest pain to bring life to others. There are people who think that being a Christian means not suffering, that following Christ means having a life without pain, without conflicts, without tears. But the Bible never promised this. Jesus himself said, "In the world you will have tribulation," but he also said, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." Paul and Silas knew this. They weren't there because they had done something wrong. They were there because they obeyed God, and yet they were beaten. This shatters any idea of an easy gospel, a comfortable gospel. The true gospel costs, but it is worth it. And when you understand this, you begin to see suffering in a different light, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to grow, to mature, to be an instrument of God, even in pain. Sometimes prison is not the end, it is the means by which God will reach someone. The jailer was just another man doing his job, hardened, perhaps skeptical, until he saw something the world cannot explain. Wounded men worshiping. Men who, even though they could have fled, stayed, because they knew the mission was not over yet. And that is how we should live, understanding that every moment, every tear, every pain can be used by God, that our life is not about comfort, but about purpose, that if it takes prison for someone to know Jesus, then so be it. Asterisk, asterisk, Paul and Silas were set free, but before that, they set others free. They set the jailer free from fear. They set the prisoners free from silence. They set hearts free with the power of praise. And that is greater than any door that opens. This is heaven touching earth through lives given. And what strikes me even more is that the next day, when the officers ordered them to be released, Paul said, "No, we are Roman citizens. You arrested us without trial. You flogged us in public. Now you want to release us. Quietly? Come here personally and release us." Paul wasn't being proud. He was teaching something. That justice is also part of the kingdom. That being a Christian isn't about accepting everything in silence. That the same faith that makes us endure. Injustice also gives us the authority to demand dignity. Paul wanted to show that the gospel isn't weakness, it's power, and that God's people can't be treated in any way. And when the officers learned that they were Roman citizens, they were afraid, because they knew they had done a serious wrong. So they went to Paul and Silas and apologized. That's right, they apologized, and they officially released them. God not only delivered them from prison, but he restored their honor. That's so important. Because sometimes God doesn't just want to pull you out of the valley. He wants you to walk out with your head held high. He wants people to see that He is with you, that your integrity will be recognized, that injustice will not have the last word. And after that, they went to Lydia's house. They met the brothers. They comforted them. They strengthened them. And only then did they continue on their journey. They were not concerned with reputation, status, or security. They were concerned with the faith of others. Even after everything they had been through, they still thought of their brothers. That is leadership. That is love. The story of Paul and Silas teaches us that prison can be stage for a miracle, that suffering can be the setting for the purest praise, that God does not forget His own, and that when all seems lost, that is when heaven can come down with force. Maybe you are feeling like this today, inside a prison, not a literal prison, but an emotional, spiritual one. A dark, cold place where it seems like no one hears you, where the wounds still hurt, where the chains still bind, where fear screams louder than hope. But I want to remind you, the same God who was with Paul and Silas in that cell is there with you now. He hasn't changed. He still hears prayers. He still receives praise. He still responds with earthquakes, with deliverance, with salvation. Don't wait until you're well to worship. Don't wait for everything to be resolved before singing. Worship in the midst of pain. Praise even with tears. Because it is in this place that heaven manifests itself. It is in this environment that God acts with greater power. Because He is perfected in weakness. What Paul and Silas experienced was not just a deliverance. It was a message. An eternal message written in the Scriptures, so that today, centuries later, you can hear and understand. God does not need to take you out of prison to visit you. He enters your cell. He finds you there and transforms the environment with His glory. And when God enters, everything changes. Chains fall, doors open, hearts surrender, because His presence is irresistible. Because where there is worship, there is manifestation. Where there is surrender, there is response. Maybe you say, but I can't sing. I hurt too much. Then pray. Tell Him how you feel. Pour out your heart. And in time, when the tears dry, a song of praise will be born. And that song of praise will be your weapon. It will be your escape. It will be your testimony. You don't have to understand everything. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to trust. Trust that God is in control. Trust that He hasn't abandoned you. Trust that this prison has a purpose. That this pain won't be in vain. The jailer, when he saw all this, thought about killing himself. He thought all was lost. But Paul shouted, "Don't do it. We're all here. This moves me." Because even though he had reasons to run away, Paul stayed. Even though he had the opportunity to escape, he stayed. Because he knew there was someone there who needed saving. And maybe that's what God is showing you today. That your process is not just about you. That your pain can reach someone. That your faithfulness can save a family. That your praise can break the chains of those who are listening. The jailer not only saved himself, but he brought salvation to his home. And it all started with praise. Wounded praise. Praise in the dark. Sincere praise. And that is what God expects from us. Not perfect worship, but true worship. There are times when praise comes in the form of tears. There are times when all we can say is, "Lord, help me." But that is already praise. That is already surrender. And God receives. God responds. God manifests Himself. If Paul and Silas had grumbled, perhaps that prison would have remained closed. But because they chose to worship, the heavens moved. And today, you can make that choice too. Choose not to give up. Choose to keep believing. Choose to worship in the midst of pain. And maybe you're listening to all this and thinking, but I'm not like Paul and Silas. I don't have that much faith. I don't know if I could worship in prison. But let me tell you something. They were human too. They were in pain too. They were afraid too. It wasn't their strength that sustained them. It was the presence of God. The same Holy Spirit that lived in them lives in you. The same grace that empowered them is available today. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be sincere. God doesn't expect a performance from you. He expects a broken heart. Maybe your prison today is depression. Maybe it's debts. Maybe it's an illness, a betrayal, a recent loss. It doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Worship. Even if you don't have the strength, worship. Even if you don't feel like it, worship. Because praise liberates. Praise transforms. Praise opens paths. And more than that, praise changes you. It aligns your heart with heaven. It strengthens your faith. It reminds you who your God is. It takes you out of the place of victim and puts you in the place of son. A son who, even in the valley, knows that the Father is present, and that changes everything. Knowing that you are not alone. Knowing that the same God who opened the Red Sea, who tore down walls, who closed the mouths of lions, is the God who is with you now inside your cell, in the midst of your pain. And if you believe, if you trust, if you open your mouth and worship, you will see heaven move. Maybe not as you expect, but always as you need. Because God never fails. God is never late. He comes, He acts, He transforms. Today, God is calling you to do the same. To raise your voice even when your heart is broken. To open your mouth even if it's just to say, Lord, I trust in you. Because that simple phrase, spoken with faith, can make the chains fall off. No matter how dark the cell, no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how many accusations are hanging over you. When God comes in, everything changes, and He is there. Now, listening to you, seeing you, feeling your pain, and waiting for you to trust, that you believe, that you worship, because just as He did with Paul and Silas, He will act. The prison will shake, the chains will fall, and you will walk out of there, not only free, but full of presence, full of purpose, full of faith, full of life. May this word reach your heart. May you not give up. May you not be silent. May you worship. Because in the end, that's what moves the sky. If this message touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who also needs to remember that God still enters prisons, that He still frees, still answers, still transforms. Subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell to receive more content that builds your faith. Leave your like if this word spoke to you. Comment below. God is with me in prison. Let's declare together that heaven still moves when there is worship, even in the midst of pain. And remember, no matter how dark the night is, God still makes the heavens tremble for those who believe.